Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, may the words of our mouths, the meditations of our hearts, and the actions that we undertake in the world around us be aligned with who we are called to be. Amen. So, I'm sure you've noticed that at the end of every service, almost every service, I use the same benediction. And it mentions loving ourselves, our neighbors, and our enemies. I do that because that is what I decided was the most important single thing I had to say. And so I thought I should say it every Sunday just in case the sermon isn't good, or people didn't like the music, or the roof is caving in and we had to move to the fellowship hall, or whatever. You know, it's like if you just take one thing from the service and it's that, I'm good with that. And we get part of that, the love of neighbors, the earliest place that it appears is in this passage from Leviticus. The rest of the passage is an expansion and extrapolation of the law. So you've heard, of course, of the Ten Commandments. But really, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, there are like 613 commandments. Because what they do is they take those 10 commandments and they extrapolate. It isn't just this one situation, but how does this principle apply to other situations? And so if you go through this reading from Leviticus, you can match all the things that are in this reading, this variety of teachings, to different parts of the Ten Commandments. Some explicitly, it opens with just, don't make graven images and idols. Part of the Ten Commandments is God reminding the people, I am the Lord your God, so that's in there. But if you want to go through on your own, you could actually match pretty easily all the things in this text to one of the Ten Commandments. And that is how Jewish interpretation of Scripture works. You take a particular passage and then you extrapolate, right? This is God's message to us. All right, what does that mean here? What does that mean here? How does it apply? One of the things that are mentioned in this extrapolation, along with loving your neighbor as yourself, is this idea not to stand idly by when the blood of your neighbor is at stake. So essentially it's saying don't fail to intervene when it's life and death, all right? At the same time, we have Jesus, who is taking this teaching, and as a good rabbi, he is extrapolating upon this teaching and saying, you've heard it said, love your neighbors, but his implication is kind of everyone does that. I mean, your neighbors tend to be people who are similar to you in socioeconomic status. In the United States, they're probably similar to us in race because we're still pretty segregated. So it's not that hard. I mean, some people's neighbors are jerks. That happens. But it's not that hard to love your neighbors. Like, that's achievable for a normal person not focusing that much effort on it. You can at least be kind to people even when they're jerks. But Jesus talks about how we should love our enemies, and one of the things that Jesus says is not to resist an evildoer. Do not resist an evildoer. And then he follows this by giving the teaching of turning the other cheek, and the teaching of if someone sues you for your cloak, you give them your shirt as well, and the teaching of going the extra mile. If someone makes you carry something for a mile, carry it an additional mile. And I'd like to look at these teachings in light of that contrast between don't stand idly by and do not resist an evildoer. Because I see at least a contrast there, if not a conflict. I also focus on this. There's so much in these texts to focus on. As I'm sitting there listening to it, I thought of like 2 other sermons, which, will come up when this text comes up again. One of the reasons I want to focus on this is because when I talk about loving ourselves, loving our neighbors, and loving our enemies, I feel like the ones we struggle with are the first and the last one. I think more people struggle with loving themselves than loving their neighbors. And I think more people struggle with loving their enemies than loving their neighbors, if that makes sense. The one in the middle is a little bit easy. I mean, if you're just polite, you'll look like you're loving your neighbor almost all the time. But inside, what are you doing with yourself? And outside, what are you doing with your enemies? And so I want to look at that side of loving our enemies. What does that mean? How do we do that? So in taking this idea of do not resist, and turn the other cheek and go the extra mile and give someone the shirt off your back, there have been thinkers who have said we kind of have to put these teachings aside because they're just not workable. Like in the last century, you have Richard Niebuhr, who, anybody heard of Richard Niebuhr? No, I wouldn't expect you to. He was a very well-known German theologian in the last century, and if you're a religious studies major who wrote a thesis on him, then you know about him. Otherwise, you don't, and you don't have to. But there was this big conflict between Richard Niebuhr and his brother, or Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr, over this idea of not intervening, of pacifism and violence. And so Reinhold Niebuhr is the one that said, we have to set this aside. Because Jesus can say turn the other cheek, but in real political situations, in the modern world, it's just not going to work. Right? And on the interpersonal level, C.S. Lewis has this anecdote where he's like, do you expect me to believe that if a crazed homicidal maniac is pushing me aside to murder my friend, that I'm supposed to let him? And so in the political and the interpersonal, people find reasons to ignore these teachings because they don't fit with this idea we even find in Leviticus, that we have a duty to intervene. We have a duty to do something. And so there's this long history of interpretation of these texts that just makes them toothless. Like, these are texts that people preached in sermons. We have sermons from American preachers who preached to slaves, to enslaved people, and they preached on these texts. Because you can see how this would be useful to tell an enslaved person, if someone strikes you, offer them the other cheek. Don't resist. And there's been harm done with that same text of people who experience domestic violence. They've gotten the terrible advice to stay in an abusive relationship, to turn the other cheek, meaning just invite people to abuse you. And so these teachings have become, at best, kind of toothless. Like, turn the other cheek kind of means just let people walk all over you. Be a doormat. Be a martyr if you want to upgrade from doormat. But let people walk all over you. And giving someone the shirt off your back has been brought down to mean be generous. Right? That's, how would you describe a generous person? They would give you the shirt off their back. I've heard that all the time. And going the extra mile, we use anecdotally all the time to say give extra effort. Like, go the extra mile is like getting extra credit in school, right? Toothless. Why would Jesus be concerned with these teachings? Why would he care if you give extra effort? Like, that doesn't make sense, at least not to me. So when these texts were read by people in the last century, especially in the 1900s and the 2000s, who were in nonviolent resistance movements, who were in the civil rights movement, who were in the movement against apartheid, who were in the solidarity movement in Eastern Europe, etc. When they read these texts, they saw these teachings from Jesus for what they probably were originally, which is instructions for acts of resistance, for acts of political resistance. Read from the standpoint of an imperialist or a colonizer, or a slave owner, or someone who's inherited that culture, it looks a certain way, but read in the context of occupation and exploitation and violence, it reads an entirely different way. And I think that context is closer to the context in Judea, which is occupied territory. You know, you have Roman soldiers telling you what to do and killing your friends and family and crucifying people who fight back. That was their context. And so in this context, I would like to give you an image of what these teachings probably meant through the lens of people who have done this work in the last century, primarily people who are part of nonviolence nonviolent movements. So in this court scene, we'll start there. So in the ancient world, people would fall into debt, just as they do now. And they would be brought to court, and they would just be sued over and over and over again. And every time you'd take more. Until you get to the point where someone owes you money, and literally all they have is the clothes they're wearing. They don't even have an extra set of clothes. You've already taken that. They don't have a place to live. You've taken that. They don't have anything except literally what they're wearing. And it was legal to sue them for that. So they could sue you for your outer garments, and then they had to give them back to you at night so you could sleep in them because you didn't have a bed or a house to live in. And this was normal. This was part of the legal system. It was a way of humiliating poor people, something that we're not shy about doing in the modern world either, in many ways. And so in this context, what can you do if you're this person and the judge with a bunch of soldiers around him is telling you, take off your jacket, you'll get it back at night when you sleep in the street? So Jesus is saying when someone does that, you take off your jacket and then you take off the rest of your clothing. And now you're in your underwear in the middle of court. This does a number of things. One, everyone who looks at you is now unclean. Because to look on the nakedness of another person, especially a man to look on the nakedness of another man, rendered you unclean. So the minute your shirt comes off, everyone in the courtroom starts screaming and panicking and averting their eyes and leaving. Because if anyone looks at you, they're going to have to go into the mikveh and wash. They're going to have to make atonement sacrifices before they can go to the temple. Additionally, what this does is this reveals explicitly the evil of what's happening. That you're literally just stripping a person who has nothing in public. The second example, going the extra mile. So in the ancient world, is very common, actually even in the modern world, during wartime or in a military occupation, a Roman soldier living in Judea, working in Judea, could just seize a random person off the street and have them carry their pack for 1 mile. Now, a Roman soldier or legionnaire would have like a 60 to 80 pound backpack with all their equipment on it, and they could just grab you out of your life, put the backpack on you, and then you'd have to carry it for 1 mile. And the idea was to limit the amount you could exploit people in Judea. Like, I could make you carry my backpack, but only for 1 mile. And after that, you can go on with your life, and I'd probably grab somebody else, make them carry it. This is a problem that's similar to the problem that led to the Third Amendment in our Constitution. Everybody know the Third Amendment by heart offhand? I got one nod. It's unusual, but some people know. The Third Amendment says that troops cannot be quartered in your house, parenthesis, unless it's during wartime and they pass a law to allow it. This is a similar problem that was happening in the ancient world. And the Third Amendment was meant to address that problem, and this teaching is the way Jesus is trying to help people address that problem. So imagine this image, right? The law says you can make someone carry your backpack for 1 mile. So you grab somebody, put your backpack on them, it's 80 pounds, and we march for 1 mile, carrying the backpack of my oppressor, the person who crucifies my neighbors. So you get to the end of the mile, and the soldier is like, all right, you got to give it back. And you're like, no, I'm good. I'm just going to keep going. You keep walking. The soldier's like, what the heck is going on? And you just keep carrying it. But the soldier's commander is like, hey, down there, get your backpack back. You can only do this for 1 mile. You're going to get in trouble. And so now you're walking along the road with this person, and you're trying to get your backpack back from them. So you're like, ask him, come on, man, what are you doing? You get me in trouble. And all you're doing is like, no, I'm just being helpful. Hey, how's it going? This is great. I'm just helping out. So again, you can't transform the situation, but you've turned the tables on the person who's exploiting you by just refusing to give them their backpack back and pretending you're being helpful. So for the turn the other cheek, I'm going to do a fun demonstration. So I need a volunteer, and you will be the slapper, not the slappee. That'll be me. And so I need someone who wants to slap me a little bit, but not too much, because we're going to pretend. Like a little bit, but not too much. Pam, you can't, no. No. I need a volunteer who's anyone but Pam. This doesn't work with spouses. So anyone interested in volunteering? Okay, come on up. Awesome. So this will be here. We're gonna be extra polite. We're gonna be extra polite.
For one thing, you get sucked into everything.
I know, right? That's how it works. That's welcome to church, right? Okay. So Jesus is very specific. He doesn't say when anyone does anything bad to you or when anyone hits you. He says when someone strikes you on the right cheek. Specifically. Why was he specific about that? I'll show you. So, imagine you are an upper-class Judean man. Right? Yep. And I am a lower-class than you Judean man. And I'm in your way. And you want to just get me out of your way, right? So, now, first rule is you can only use your right hand because your left hand is unclean. Can't use that, right? So only use your right hand, and you have to strike me on the right cheek, okay? So how would you do that? Right, backhanded, exactly, right? So you do a backhand. Now, the backhand is culturally universal. It doesn't matter where on planet Earth you are. If someone does this to you, it means the same thing everywhere. All of you know what it means, right? Okay. So now, you have struck me on the right cheek, right? So now, I'm supposed to get out of here. What I'm supposed to do is go, oh, yeah, okay, right? But I don't. I stand here, and I do this. How are you going to strike me?
Either
right?
this way.
Uh-huh. Or you don't, or you punch me.
Okay.
Another option, you could, because they punch back then.
Okay.
So you punch me. Okay.
Sorry.
Now, thank you. We're good.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yay! It's okay. The downside to all these is that the person using these resistance techniques does not have power. That's assumed, right? You can't tell the Roman soldier no, they'll kill you. You can't tell the judge no, they'll kill you. You can't fight the person who's smacking you because they'll kill you. But, as you saw, the initial strike is a backhand to the right side of the face. But when I turn my other cheek to the person and I don't move out of the way, they're forced to do one of three things. One, slap me this way, which is, in this culture and in most cultures, it is not a manly way to slap. That you're slapping like a woman. You look absurd. So in this culture, that's how it would be read, right? The other option is to punch me, which hurts, but is what you do to an equal. Before, you were batting me aside with contempt. Now, we're in a fist fight. And once again, it's a way to turn the tables for someone who has no power in the situation. And my point is, when Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Desmond Tutu and Mohandas Gandhi read this text, that's what they saw. Because they're in the context of trying to win their freedom and their basic rights and having dogs sicked on them and being beaten and being imprisoned and being stripped. And so these were experiences they'd had. And they saw this for what I believe it is. Instructions for nonviolent resistance in this context, which were literally 2,000 years ahead of their time. So now we're in the situation. Do not resist an evildoer, but resist. So Jesus says, don't resist an evildoer, and then gives instructions for resisting. And he's quoting a text from Leviticus that he would have known quite well. Many of his listeners would have known quite well. Says that you are not to stand idly by when the blood of your neighbor is at stake. There's a duty to intervene. Don't resist, but resist. There are some hints in the Greek as to how this would have sounded different to them than it does to us. But I don't want to have to refer to Greek to understand this. We need to understand it in English too. So look at what is the problem in the three situations Jesus is referencing. The court situation, the soldier situation, the backhand situation. What's the problem there? I don't think the problem is one violent person that you met on the street. I don't think the problem is one evil judge. And I don't think the problem is one cruel soldier. Because if you get rid of that one violent person, you're going to have another. And if you get rid of the one cruel judge, another judge is going to take their place and apply the same rules. And legionnaires are trained to be interchangeable. You take one out, the next one fills their place. That's their whole job. The problem is the system in which they work. The problem isn't any of the individuals involved. You can change the individuals, the system will remain. We see this whenever police officers kill an unarmed person, and we catch them, and they're stripped of their position, and sometimes they're even prosecuted and put in jail. What happens? Police keep killing unarmed people. It doesn't even slow down. Or we see this when there's a mass shooting, and we catch the shooter, and we have their mug shot up, and they get tried, and they go to prison. What happens? There's another mass shooting. There's 50 mass shootings in the time it takes to get them to the courthouse. Plucking out the one person out of the system and punishing them doesn't fix it. It makes us feel better for a little while, but that's a distraction, because we feel better even though nothing has changed. And the same evil thing is going to happen again very predictably. So we have this idea of not resisting, and then Leviticus tells us there's a duty to intervene. And then when describing not resisting, it's like when Jesus describes neighbors. They ask him, who's my neighbor? So he describes strangers and enemies. When Jesus says, do not resist an evildoer, he then describes how to resist people doing evil. So the way that this makes sense to me is to say, okay, we're not meant to resist an evildoer. We're meant to resist every evil system. And we find ways to do that. That becomes our priority. And that's something these people in nonviolent resistance movements saw very clearly. Like Martin Luther King Jr. could change the heart of a cop, and that wouldn't end Jim Crow. And Gandhi could change the heart of a British soldier, and that wouldn't have ended British occupation in India. And Desmond Tutu could have changed the heart of a white person in South Africa, and that wouldn't have ended apartheid. So they had to find ways to resist the system. But they also discovered something. When you're resisting the system, these opportunities open up for the person who's in the system to realize they shouldn't be. So if you're part of a system and you harm me and I harm you back, now we're enemies, we're fighting, and you have a reason to hate me, I have a reason to hate you, we're stuck. But if you're part of an evil system and you do something, and I resist the system, but not you specifically, it isn't even personal, you have a moment to realize what's going on. Like the person who backhands someone in the street, expecting them to cringe and back away, and they don't, and they stand there. And they're still there, and they insist, like, you're going to do it again? And you have a moment. Why am I doing this? What did I expect? And everyone around you has a moment to think, why do we do that? Why do we put up with this? Or in court, especially in this dramatic moment where you start stripping, everyone there has a moment to realize, whoa, 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 what are we doing? We're stripping the clothing off of poor people. This is horrible. Maybe we should do something else. Maybe we should change this. And even a soldier who forces you to carry their pack because it's heavy and it's hot, and you won't give it back, and they have to negotiate how to get their pack back before they're in trouble from their commander. Everyone has a moment to see this absurd situation and think, wait, this isn't right. Why are we doing this? And so we don't resist the person, but we do resist the system. Because that opens an opportunity for the person who's doing evil in that system to be set free. In the same way that we are seeking to be set free. And we can realize, actually, we're on the same side. And we have the same opponent. Amen.